This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Warlords of Mars, written by Edgar Rice Burroughs and read by J.D. Weber on the south shores of Lake Superior. Chapter 9. With the Yellow Men. Thuvan Dihn was not long in joining me, and though we found the hooked weapon a strange and savage thing with which to deal, the three of us soon dispatched the 5 black-bearded warriors who opposed us. When the battle was over, our new acquaintance turned to me, and removing the shield from his wrist, held it out. I did not know the significance of his act, but judged that it was but a form of expressing his gratitude to me. I afterward learned that it symbolized the offering of a man's life in return for some great favor done him, and my act of refusing, which I had immediately done, was what was expected of me. "Then accept from Taulu, Prince of Marantina," said the yellow man, "this token of my gratitude." And reaching beneath one of his wide sleeves, he withdrew a bracelet, and placed it upon my arm. He then went through the same ceremony with Thuvan Dihn. Next he asked our names, and from what land we hailed. He seemed quite familiar with the geography of the outer world, and when I said I was from Helium, he raised his eyebrows. "Ah," he said, "you seek your ruler and his company." "Know you of them?" I asked. "But little more than that they were captured by my uncle, Salensus Oll, Jeddak of Jeddaks, ruler of Okar, land of the yellow men of Barsoom. As to their fate I know nothing, for I am at war with my uncle, who would crush my power in the principality of Marantina. These from whom you have just saved me are warriors he has sent out to find and slay me, for they know that often I come alone to hunt and kill the sacred ape which Salensus Oll so much reveres. It is partly because I hate his religion that Salensus Oll hates me, but mostly does he fear my growing power and the great faction which has arisen throughout Okar that would be glad to see me ruler of Okar and Jeddak of Jeddaks in his place. He is a cruel and tyrannous master whom all hate, and were it not for the great fear they have of him, I could raise an army overnight that would wipe out the few that might remain loyal to him. My own people are faithful to me, and the little valley of Marantina has paid no tribute to the court of Salensus Oll for a year. Nor can he force us, for a dozen men may hold the narrow way to Marantina against 1,000,000. But now as to thine own affairs, how may I aid you? My palace is at your disposal, if you wish to honor me by coming to Marantina." "When our work is done we shall be glad to accept your invitation," I replied. "But now you can assist us most by directing us to the court of Salensus Oll and suggesting some means by which we may gain admission to the city and the palace, or whatever other place we find our friends to be confined." Taulu gazed ruefully at our smooth faces and at Thuvan Dihn's red skin and my white one. "First you must come to Marantina," he said, "for a great change must be wrought in your appearance before you can hope to enter any city in Okar. You must have yellow faces and black beards, and your apparel and trappings must be those least likely to arouse suspicion. In my palace is one who can make you appear as truly yellow men as does Salensus Oll himself." His counsel seemed wise, and as there was apparently no other way to ensure a successful entry to Cadabra, the capital city of Okar, we set out with Taulu, Prince of Marantina, for his little rock-bound country. The way was over some of the worst traveling I have ever seen, and I do not wonder that in this land where there are neither thoats nor flyers that Marantina is in little fear of invasion. But at last we reached our destination, the first view of which I had from a slight elevation a half-mile from the city. Nestled in a deep valley lay a city of Martian concrete, whose every street and plaza and open space was roofed with glass. All about lay snow and ice, but there was none upon the rounded, dome-like crystal covering that enveloped the whole city. Then I saw how these people combated the rigors of the Arctic, and lived in luxury and comfort in the midst of a land of perpetual ice. Their cities were veritable hothouses, and when I had come within this one, my respect and admiration for the scientific and engineering skill of this varied nation was unbounded. The moment we entered the city, Taulu threw off his outer garments of fur, as did we, and I saw that his apparel differed but little from that of the red races of Barsoom. Except for his leathern harness, covered thick with jewels and metal, he was naked, nor could one have comfortably worn apparel in that warm and humid atmosphere. For 3 days we remained the guests of Prince Talul. During that time he showered upon us every attention and courtesy within his power. He showed us all that was of interest in his great city. The Marantina atmosphere plant will maintain life indefinitely in the cities of the North Pole after all life upon the balance of dying Mars is extinct through the failure of the air supply. Should the great central plant again cease functioning as it did upon that memorable occasion that gave me the opportunity of restoring life and happiness to the strange world that I had already learned to love so well. He showed us the heating system that stores the sun's rays in great reservoirs beneath the city, and how little is necessary to maintain the perpetual summer heat of the glorious garden spot within this Arctic paradise. Broad avenues of sod sown with the seed of the ochre vegetation of the Dead Sea bottoms carried the noiseless traffic of light and airy ground flyers that are the only form of artificial transportation used north of the gigantic ice barrier. The broad tires of these unique flyers are but rubber-like gas bags filled with the 8th Barsoomian ray, or ray of propulsion, that remarkable discovery of the Martians that has made possible the great fleets of mighty airships that render the red men of the outer world supreme. It is this ray which propels the inherent or reflected light of the planet off into space, and when confined gives to the Martian craft their airy buoyancy. The ground flyers of Marantina contain just sufficient buoyancy in their automobile-like wheels to give the cars traction for steering purposes, and though the hind wheels are geared to the engine and aid in driving the machine, the bulk of this work is carried by a small propeller at the stern. I know of no more delightful sensation than that of riding in one of these luxuriously appointed cars which skim, light and airy as feathers, along the soft, mossy avenues of Marantina. They move with absolute noiselessness between borders of crimson sward and beneath arching trees gorgeous with the wondrous blooms that mark so many of the highly cultivated varieties of Barsoomian vegetation. By the end of the 3rd day, the court barber, I can think of no other earthly appellation by which to describe him, had wrought so remarkable a transformation in both Thuvan Dihn and myself that our own wives would never have known us. Our skins were of the same lemon color as his own, and great black beards and mustaches had been deftly affixed to our smooth faces. The trappings of warriors of Okar aided in the deception, and for where beyond the hothouse cities we each had suits of black and yellow-striped orlik. Talul gave us careful directions for the journey to Cadabra, the capital city of the Okar nation, which is the racial name of the Yellow Men. This good friend even accompanied us part way, and then, promising to aid us in any way that he found possible, bade us adieu. On parting he slipped upon my finger a curiously wrought ring set with a dead black, lustreless stone which appeared more like a bit of bituminous coal than the priceless Barsoomian gem which in reality it is. There had been but 3 others cut from the mother stone, he said, which is in my possession. These 3 are worn by nobles high in my confidence, all of whom have been sent on secret missions to the court of Salensus Oll. Should you come within 50 feet of any of these 3, you will feel a rapid pricking sensation in the finger upon which you wear this ring. He who wears one of its mates will experience the same feeling. It is caused by an electrical action that takes place the moment 2 of these gems cut from the same mother stone come within the radius of each other's power. By it you will know that a friend is at hand upon whom you may depend for assistance in time of need. Should another wearer of one of these gems call upon you for aid, do not deny him, and should death threaten you, swallow the ring rather than let it fall into the hands of enemies. Guard it with your life, John Carter, for some day it may mean more than life to you. With this parting admonition our good friend turned back toward Marantina, and we set our faces in the direction of the city of Cadabra and the court of Salensus Oll, Jeddak of Jeddaks. That very evening we came within sight of the walled and glass-roofed city of Cadabra. It lies in a low depression near the pole, surrounded by rocky snow-clad hills. From the pass through which we entered the valley, we had a splendid view of this great city of the north. Its crystal dome sparkled in the brilliant sunlight, gleaming above the frost-covered outer wall that circles the entire 100 miles of its circumference. At regular intervals great gates give entrance to the city, but even at the distance from which we looked upon the massive pile, we could see that all were closed, and in accordance with Talul's suggestion we deferred attempting to enter the city until the following morning. As he had said, we found numerous caves in the hillsides about us, and into one of these we crept for the night. Our warm oluk skins kept us perfectly comfortable, and it was only after a most refreshing sleep that we awoke shortly after daylight on the following morning. Already the city was astir, and from several of the gates we saw parties of yellow men emerging. Following closely each detail of the instruction given us by our good friend of Marantina, we remained concealed for several hours until one party of some half-dozen warriors had passed along the trail below our hiding-place and entered the hills by way of the pass along which we had come the previous evening. After giving them time to get well out of sight of our cave, Thuvan Dihn and I crept out and followed them, overtaking them when they were well into the hills. When we had come almost to them, I called aloud to their leader. When the whole party halted and turned toward us, the crucial test had come. Could we but deceive these men, the rest would be comparatively easy. "Kaor," I cried as I came closer to them. "Kaor," responded the officer in charge of the party. "We be from Illal," I continued, giving the name of the most remote city of Okar, which has little or no intercourse with Kerabra. "Only yesterday we arrived, and this morning the captain of the gate told us that you were setting out to hunt orluks, which is a sport we do not find in our own neighborhood. We have hastened after you to pray that you allow us to accompany you." The officer was entirely deceived, and graciously permitted us to go with them for the day. The chance guess that they were bound upon an orluk hunt proved correct, and Talul had said that the chances were 10 to 1 that such would be the mission of any party leaving Kerabra by the pass through which we entered the valley, since that way leads directly to the vast plains frequented by this elephantine beast of prey. Insofar as the hunt was concerned, the day was a failure, for we did not see a single orluk. But this proved more than fortunate for us, since the yellow men were so chagrined by their misfortune that they would not enter the city by the same gate by which they had left it in the morning, as it seemed that they had made great boast to the captain of that gate about their skill at this dangerous sport. We therefore approached Kerabra at a point several miles from that at which the party had quitted it in the morning, and so were relieved of the danger of embarrassing questions and explanations on the part of the gate captain, whom we had said had directed us to this particular hunting party. We had come quite close to the city when my attention was attracted toward a tall, black shaft that reared its head several hundred feet into the air from what appeared to be a tangled mass of junk or wreckage, now partially snow-covered. I did not dare venture an inquiry for fear of arousing suspicion by evident ignorance of something which as a yellow man I should have known. But before we reached the city gate I was to learn the purpose for that grim shaft and the meaning of the mighty accumulation beneath it. We had come almost to the gate when one of the party called to his fellows, at the same time pointing toward the distant southern horizon. Following the direction he indicated, my eyes descried the hull of a large flyer approaching rapidly from above the crest of the encircling hills. "Still other fools who would solve the mysteries of the forbidden north," said the officer, half to himself. "Will they never cease their fatal curiosity?" "Let us hope not," answered one of the warriors, "for then what should we do for slaves and sport?" "True, but what stupid beasts they are to continue to come to a region from whence none of them ever has returned." "Let us tarry and watch the end of this one," suggested one of the men. The officer looked toward the city. "The watch has seen him," he said. "We may remain, for we may be needed." I looked toward the city and saw several hundred warriors issuing from the nearest gate. They moved leisurely, as though there were no need for haste, nor was there, as I was presently to learn. Then I turned my eyes once more toward the flyer. She was moving rapidly toward the city, and when she had come close enough I was surprised to see that her propellers were idle. Straight for that grim shaft she bore. At the last minute I saw the great blades move to reverse her, yet on she came as though drawn by some mighty irresistible power. Intense excitement prevailed upon her deck, where men were running hither and thither, manning the guns and preparing to launch the small one-man flyers, a fleet of which is part of the equipment of every Martian war vessel. Closer and closer to the black shaft the ship sped. In another instant she must strike, and then I saw the familiar signal flown that sends the lesser boats in a great flock from the deck of the mother ship. Instantly 100 tiny flyers rose from her deck, like a swarm of huge dragonflies, but scarcely were they clear of the battleship than the nose of each turned toward the shaft, and they too rushed on a frightful speed toward the same, now seemingly inevitable end that menaced the larger vessel. A moment later the collision came. Men were hurled in every direction from the ship's deck, while she, bent and crumpled, took the last long plunge to the scrap heap at the shaft's base. With her fell a shower of her own tiny flyers, for each of them had come in violent collision with the solid shaft. I noticed that the wrecked flyers scraped down the shaft's side, and that their fall was not as rapid as might have been expected. And then suddenly the secret of the shaft burst upon me, and with it an explanation of the cause that prevented a flyer that passed too far across the ice barrier ever returning. The shaft was a mighty magnet, and when once a vessel came within the radius of its powerful attraction for the aluminum steel that enters so largely into the construction of all Barsoomian craft, no power on earth could prevent such an end as we had just witnessed. I afterward learned that the shaft rests directly over the magnetic pole of Mars, but whether this aids in any way to its incalculable power of attraction I do not know. I am a fighting man, not a scientist. Here, at last, was an explanation of the long absence of Tardos Mors and Mors Kajak. These valiant and intrepid warriors had dared the mysteries and dangers of the frozen north to search for Thoris, whose long absence had bowed in grief the head of his beautiful mother, Dejah Thoris, Princess of Helium. The moment that the last of the flyers came to rest at the base of the shaft, the black-bearded yellow warriors swarmed over the mass of wreckage upon which they lay, making prisoners of those who were uninjured and occasionally dispatching with a sword thrust one of the wounded who seemed prone to resent their taunts and insults. A few of the uninjured red men battled bravely against their cruel foes, but for the most part they seemed too overwhelmed by the horror of the catastrophe that had befallen them to do more than submit sublimely to the golden chains with which they were manacled. When the last of the prisoners had been confined, the party returned to the city, at the gate of which we met a pack of fierce, gold-collared Apps, each of which marched between two warriors, who held them with strong chains of the same metal as their collars. Just beyond the gate the attendants loosened the whole terrible herd, and as they bounded off toward the grim black shaft I did not need to ask to know their mission. Had there not been those within the cruel city of Cadabra who needed succour far worse than the poor unfortunate dead and dying out there in the cold upon the bent and broken carcasses of 1,000 flyers, I could not have restrained my desire to hasten back and do battle with those horrid creatures that had been dispatched to rend and devour them. As it was, I could but follow the yellow warriors with bowed head, and give thanks for the chance that had given Thuvan Dihn and me such easy ingress to the capital of Salensus Oll. Once within the gates we had no difficulty in eluding our friends of the morning, and presently found ourselves in a Martian hostelry. End of Chapter 9. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Warlords of Mars, written by Edgar Rice Burroughs and read by J.D. Weber on the south shores of Lake Superior. Chapter 10. In Durance. The public houses of Barsoom, I have found, vary but little. There is no privacy for other than married couples. Men without their wives are escorted to a large chamber, the floor of which is usually of white marble or heavy glass, kept scrupulously clean. Here are many small, raised platforms for the guests' sleeping silks and furs. and if he have none of his own clean, fresh ones are furnished at a nominal charge. Once a man's belongings have been deposited upon one of these platforms, he is a guest of the house, and that platform his own until he leaves. No one will disturb or molest his belongings, as there are no thieves upon Mars. As assassination is the one thing to be feared, the proprietors of the hostelries furnish armed guards, who pace back and forth through the sleeping rooms day and night. The number of guards and the gorgeousness of their trappings quite usually denote the status of the hotel. No meals are served in these houses, but generally a public eating place adjoins them. Baths are connected with the sleeping chambers, and each guest is required to bathe daily or depart from the hotel. Usually, on a second or third floor, there is a large sleeping room for single women guests, but its appointments do not vary materially from the chamber occupied by men. The guards who watch the women remain in the corridor outside the sleeping chamber, while female slaves pace back and forth among the sleepers within, ready to notify the warriors should their presence be required. I was surprised to note that all the guards with the hotel at which we stopped were red men, and on inquiring of one of them I learned that they were slaves purchased by the proprietors of the hotels from the government. The man whose post was past my sleeping platform had been commander of the navy of a great Martian nation, but fate had carried his flagship across the ice barrier within the radius of power of the magnetic shaft, and now for many tedious years he had been a slave of the yellow men. He told me that princes, Jeds, and even Jeddaks of the outer world were among the menials who served the yellow race, but when I asked him if he had heard of the fate of Mors Kajak or Tardos Mors, he shook his head, saying that he never had heard of their being prisoners here, though he was very familiar with the reputations and fame they bore in the outer world. Neither had he heard any rumor of the coming of the father of Therns and the black Dator of the firstborn, but he hastened to explain that he knew little of what took place within the palace. I could see that he wondered not a little that a yellow man should be so inquisitive about certain red prisoners from beyond the ice barrier, and that I should be so ignorant of customs and conditions among my own race. In fact, I had forgotten my disguise upon discovering a red man pacing before my sleeping platform, but his growing expression of surprise warned me in time, for I had no mind to reveal my identity to any unless some good could come of it, and I did not see how this poor fellow could serve me yet, though I had it in my mind that later I might be the means of serving him and all the other thousands of prisoners who do the bidding of their stern masters in Cadabra. Thuvan Dihn and I discussed our plans as we sat together among our sleeping silks and furs that night, in the midst of the hundreds of yellow men who occupied the apartment with us. We spoke in low whispers, but, as that is only what courtesy demands in a public sleeping place, we roused no suspicion. At last, determining that all must be but idle speculation until after we had had a chance to explore the city and attempt to put into execution the plan that Talul had suggested, we bade each other good night and turned to sleep. After breakfasting the following morning, we set out to see Cadabra, and as, through the generosity of the Prince of Marantina, we were well supplied with the funds current in Okar, we purchased a handsome ground flyer. Having learned to drive them while in Marantina, we spent a delightful and profitable day exploring the city, and late in the afternoon, at the hour Talul told us we would find government officials in their offices, we stopped before a magnificent building on the plaza opposite the royal grounds and the palace. Here we walked boldly in past the armed guard at the door, to be met by a red slave within who asked our wishes. "Tell Sorav, your master, that 2 warriors from Illal wish to take service in the palace guard," I said. Sorav, Talul had told us, was the commander of the forces of the palace, and as men from the further cities of Okar, and especially Illal, were less likely to be tainted with the germ of intrigue which had for years infected the household of Salensus Oll, he was sure that we would be welcomed and few questions asked us. He had primed us with such general information as he thought would be necessary for us to pass muster before Sorav, after which we would have to undergo a further examination before Salensus Oll, that he might determine our physical fitness and our ability as warriors. The little experience we had had with the strange hooked sword of the yellow man and his cup-like shield made it seem rather unlikely that either of us could pass this final test. but there was the chance that we might be quartered in the palace of Salensus Oll for several days, after being accepted by Sorav before the Jeddak of Jeddaks would find time to put us to the final test. After a wait of several minutes in an antechamber, we were summoned into the private office of Sorav, where we were courteously greeted by this ferocious-appearing black-bearded officer. He asked us our names and stations in our own city, and having received replies that were evidently satisfactory to him, he put certain questions to us that Talu had foreseen and prepared us for. The interview could not have lasted over 10 minutes when Sorav summoned an aide whom he instructed to record us properly, and then escort us to the quarters in the palace which are set aside for aspirants to membership in the palace guard. The aide took us to his own office first, where he measured and weighed and photographed us simultaneously with a machine ingeniously devised for that purpose, 5 copies being instantly reproduced in 5 different offices of the government, 2 of which are located in other cities miles distant. Then he led us through the palace grounds to the main guardroom of the palace, there turning us over to the officer in charge. This individual again questioned us briefly, and finally dispatched a soldier to guide us to our quarters. These were found located upon the 2nd floor of the palace in a semi-detached tower at the rear of the edifice. When we asked our guide why we were quartered so far from the guardroom, he replied that the custom of the older members of the guard are picking quarrels with aspirants to try their mettle had resulted in so many deaths that it was found difficult to maintain the guard at its full strength while this custom prevailed. Salensus Oll had, therefore, set apart these quarters for aspirants, and here they were securely locked against the danger of attack by members of the guard. This unwelcome information put a sudden check to all our well-laid plans, for it meant that we should virtually be prisoners in the palace of Salensus Oll until the time that he should see fit to give us the final examination for efficiency. As it was this interval upon which we had banked to accomplish so much in our search for Dejah Thoris and Thuvan of Ptarth, our chagrin was unbounded when we heard the great lock click behind our guide, as he had quitted us after ushering us into the chambers we were to occupy. With a wry face I turned to Thuvan Dihn. My companion but shook his head disconsolately and walked to one of the windows upon the far side of the apartment. Scarcely had he gazed beyond them than he called to me in a tone of suppressed excitement and surprise. In an instant I was by his side. "Look," said Thuvan Dihn, pointing toward the courtyard below. As my eyes followed the direction indicated, I saw 2 women pacing back and forth in an enclosed garden. At the same moment I recognized them. They were Dejah Thoris and Thuvan of Ptarth. There were they whom I had trailed from one pole to another, the length of a world. Only 10 feet of space and a few metal bars separated me from them. With a cry I attracted their attention, and as Dejah Thoris looked up full into my eyes, I made the sign of love that the men of Barsoom make to their women. To my astonishment and horror, her head went high, and as a look of utter contempt touched her finely chiseled features, she turned her back full upon me. My body is covered with the scars of 1,000 conflicts, but never in all my long life have I suffered such anguish from a wound, for this time the steel of a woman's look had entered my heart. With a groan I turned away and buried my face in my arms. I heard Thuvan Dihn call aloud to Thuvan, but an instant later his exclamation of surprise betokened that he too had been repulsed by his own daughter. "They will not even listen," he cried to me. "They have put their hands over their ears and walked to the further end of the garden. Ever heard you of such mad work, John Carter? The 2 must be bewitched." Presently I mustered the courage to return to the window, for even though she spurned me, I loved her, and could not keep my eyes from feasting upon her divine face and figure. But when she saw me looking, she again turned away. I was at my wits' end to account for her strange actions, and that Thuvan too had turned against her father seemed incredible. Could it be that my incomparable princess still clung to the hideous faith from which I had rescued her world? Could it be that she looked upon me with loathing and contempt because I had returned from the valley door, or because I had desecrated the temples and persons of the holy Therns? To naught else could I ascribe her strange deportment, yet it seemed far from possible that such could be the case, for the love of Dejah Thoris for John Carter had been a great and wondrous love, far above racial distinctions, creed, or religion. As I gazed ruefully at the back of her haughty, royal head, a gate at the opposite end of the garden opened, and a man entered. As he did so, he turned and slipped something into the hand of the yellow guardsman beyond the gate. Nor was the distance too great that I might not see that money had passed between them. Instantly I knew that this newcomer had bribed his way within the garden. Then he turned in the direction of the two women, and I saw that he was none other than Thuvan, the black Dehtor of the firstborn. He approached quite close to them before he spoke, and as they turned at the sound of his voice, I saw Dejah Thoris shrink from him. There was a nasty leer upon his face as he stepped close to her and spoke again. I could not hear his words, but her answer came clearly. "The granddaughter of Tardos Mors can always die," she said, "but she could never live at the price you name." Then I saw the black scoundrel go upon his knees beside her, fairly groveling in the dirt, pleading with her. Only part of what he said came to me, for though he was evidently laboring under the stress of passion and excitement, it was equally apparent that he did not dare raise his voice for fear of detection. "I would save you from Mata Shang," I heard him say. "You know the fate that awaits you at his hand. Would you not choose me rather than the other?" "I would choose neither," replied Dejah Thoris, "even were I free to choose, as you know well I am not." "You are free," he cried. "John Carter, Prince of Helium, is dead." "I know better than that. But even were he dead, and I must needs choose another mate, it should be a plant man or a great white ape in preference to either Mata Shang or you, black Kalat," she answered with a sneer of contempt. Of a sudden the vicious beast lost all control of himself. As with a vile oath he leaped at the slender woman, gripping her tender throat in his brute clutch. Thuvia screamed and sprang to aid her fellow prisoner, and at the same instant I too went mad, and tearing at the bars that spanned my window, I ripped them from their sockets as they had been but copper wire. Hurling myself through the aperture, I reached the garden, but 100 feet from where the black was choking the life from Dejah Thoris, and with a single great bound I was upon him. I spoke no word as I tore his defiling fingers from that beautiful throat, nor did I utter a sound as I hurled him 20 feet from me. Foaming with rage, Thuvan regained his feet and charged me like a mad bull. "Yellow man," he shrieked, "you knew not upon whom you had laid your vile hands, but ere I am done with you, you will know well what it means to offend the person of a firstborn." Then he was upon me, reaching for my throat, and precisely as I had done that day in the courtyard of the temple of Ishis, I did here in the garden of the palace of Salensus Oll. I ducked beneath his outstretched arms, and as he lunged past me I planted a terrific right upon the side of his jaw. Just as he had done upon that other occasion he did now. Like a top he spun round, his knees gave beneath him, and he crumpled to the ground at my feet. Then I heard a voice behind me. It was the deep voice of authority that marks the ruler of men, and when I turned to face the resplendent figure of a giant yellow man, I did not need to ask to know that it was Salensus Oll. At his right stood Mata Shang, and behind them a score of guardsmen. "Who are you?" he cried, "and what means this intrusion within the precincts of the woman's garden? I do not recall your face. How came you here?" But for his last words I should have forgotten my disguise entirely, and told him outright that I was John Carter, Prince of Helium. But his question recalled me to myself. I pointed to the dislodged bars of the window above. "I am an aspirant to membership in the palace guard," I said, "and from yonder window in the tower where I was confined awaiting the final test for fitness, I saw this brute attack this woman. I could not stand idly by, O Jeddak, and see this thing done within the very palace grounds, and yet feel that I was fit to serve and guard your royal person. I had evidently made an impression upon the ruler of Okar by my fair words, and when he had turned to Dejah Thoris and Thuvan Dihn, and both had corroborated my statements, it began to look pretty dark for Thuvan. I saw the ugly gleam in Mata Shang's evil eyes as Dejah Thoris narrated all that had passed between Thuvan and herself, and when she came to that part which dealt with my interference with the Dehtor of the firstborn, her gratitude was quite apparent, though I could see by her eyes that something puzzled her strangely. I did not wonder at her attitude toward me while others were present, but that she should have denied me while she and Thuvia were the only occupants of the garden still cut me sorely. As the examination proceeded, I cast a glance at Thuvan and startled him looking wide-eyed and wonderingly at me, and then of a sudden he laughed full in my face. A moment later Salensus Oll turned toward the black. "What have you to say in explanation of these charges?" he asked, in a deep and terrible voice. "Dare you aspire to one whom the father of Thurns has chosen, one who might even be fit mate for the Jeddak of Jeddaks himself?" And then the black-bearded tyrant turned and cast a sudden greedy look upon Dejah Thoris, as though with the words a new thought and a new desire had sprung up within his mind and breast. Thuvan had been about to reply, and with a malicious grin upon his face was pointing an accusing finger at me, when Salensus Oll's words and the expression of his face cut him short. A cunning look crept into his eyes, and I knew from the expression of his face that his next words were not the ones he had intended to speak. "O mightiest of Jeddaks," he said, "the man and the woman do not speak the truth. The fellow had come into the garden to assist them to escape. I was beyond and overheard their conversation, and when I entered, the woman screamed and the man sprang upon me and would have killed me. What know you of this man? He is a stranger to you, and I dare say that you will find him an enemy and a spy. Let him be put on trial, Salensus Oll, rather than your friend and guest, Thuvan Dihn of the Firstborn." Salensus Oll looked puzzled. He turned again and looked upon Dejah Thoris, and then Thuvan stepped quite close to him and whispered something in his ear. What, I know not. Presently the yellow ruler turned to one of his officers. "See that this man be securely confined until we have time to go deeper into this affair," he commanded, "and as bars alone seem inadequate to restrain him, let chains be added." Then he turned and left the garden, taking Dejah Thoris with him, his hand upon her shoulder. Thuvan and Matashang went also, and as they reached the gateway the black turned and laughed again aloud in my face. What could be the meaning of his sudden change toward me? Could he suspect my true identity? It must be that, and the thing that had betrayed me was the trick and blow that had laid him low for the second time. As the guards dragged me away, my heart was very sad and bitter indeed, for now to the two relentless enemies that had hounded her for so long another and a more powerful one had been added, for I would have been but a fool had I not recognized the sudden love for Dejah Thoris that had just been born in the terrible breast of Salensus Oll, Jeddak of Jeddaks, ruler of Okar. End of Chapter 10.